The irrigation trench had opinions about being rebuilt, and none of them were flattering. Every time the veteran set his spade down, the soil sighed like an old bureaucrat asked to approve one more form. He told it that forms were his specialty, that he'd once filled out a casualty report in triplicate while under fire, and that dirt could do worse than listen to him. The soil did not apologize, but it did stop collapsing for a while, which he counted as progress. She worked a few meters away, humming in a register that the local birds found deeply offensive. They scattered every time she hit a certain note, and she pretended not to notice. When the veteran finally looked up, she was already looking at him, ears long, tapered, unmistakably not human, tilted in a way that suggested amusement. "You argue with ground a lot?" she asked. "Only when it starts it," he said. "I'm a peaceful man." "That's not what your file says. Those are lies spread by jealous rocks." She laughed, a sound that came easily but never stayed long. It hopped out, waved, then vanished as if it had overstayed its welcome. She returned to adjusting the flow regulator with careful hands, fingers moving with the confidence of someone who'd been fixing things since before she was allowed to ask why they broke in the first place. The world they were on had a name made of syllables that slid off the tongue like oil. No one used it. Everyone called it the quiet field. It had been settled, abandoned, resettled, and then forgotten again, which made it perfect for agriculture and damaged people. The veteran fit right in. He had come here because the war had finally run out of uses for him, and because the recruitment officer had said quiet like it was a promise instead of a warning. She had been here longer. Longer than him, longer than most. Her people were good at surviving places no one else wanted, and so they were sent there often with polite contracts and unspoken rules. They could stay. They could work. They could bear children. They could not be chosen. The veteran didn't know all that yet. He knew her name, which translated badly into standard and better into a joke about stubborn weather. He knew she could fix an irrigation line faster than a service drone and complained less while doing it. He knew that when the suns dipped low, she liked to sit on the edge of the canal and kick her boots off, ears flicking at insects that didn't quite dare land on her. That evening, the water finally ran true. The channels carried it cleanly across the field, and the seedlings lifted their leaves like an audience acknowledging a performance. The veteran wiped his hands on his trousers and sat beside her. Somewhere a farm bot played an old Terran marching tune at half speed, which made it sound like it was reconsidering its life choices. She offered him a ration bar. He inspected it suspiciously. "Is this one of yours?" he asked. "Yes." "Last time I ate one of yours, my teeth tried to leave my mouth." "You're exaggerating." "One of them packed a bag." She smiled anyway, and he ate it anyway, and the teeth stayed put out of sheer stubbornness. They watched the water move. Quiet Field lived up to its name in moments like this, when even the machines seemed to whisper. "No one marries my kind," she said, as if she were commenting on the weather. "It's not forbidden, it's just unnecessary." He didn't answer right away. He had learned in war and after that silence could be a courtesy if you handled it gently. He waited for the rest, and she gave it to him without looking. "We're useful. We adapt. We carry traits that survive radiation, famine, bad governance." One ear twitched. "We can bear children for others. That's the arrangement. We're allowed to exist because we're practical." She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it heavier. Like a fact you'd lived with so long it had worn a groove into you. He picked at the wrapper of the ration bar. "That's a terrible arrangement." She shrugged. "It works. The galaxy likes things that work." "Yeah," he said. The galaxy also liked the Mark 7 plasma rifle. and that thing exploded if you looked at it funny. She glanced at him then, surprised, and he saw the moment she braced for something. Pity, maybe, or the careful discomfort people wore like a badge when confronted with truths they didn't want to carry home. "Where I'm from," he said, "marriage isn't about usefulness, or bloodlines, or what you can produce." He smiled, a small, crooked thing. "It's about choosing someone and being chosen back. Most of the time, it's also about arguing over who forgot to clean the recycler." She stared at him. He felt the weight of it land, the way words sometimes did when they hit a place no one had dusted in years. "That's inefficient," she said finally. "Oh, extremely," he agreed. "If we wanted efficiency, we'd all marry our to-do lists." Her laugh came back, stayed a little longer this time. They sat there as the sun sank, the water whispered, and somewhere far away, the galaxy continued to make its arrangements. On the quiet field, a veteran and an alien woman with long ears shared a joke, and something small but stubborn shifted, like soil deciding at last to hold. The pump refused to start, which meant it was winning. He leaned back against the metal housing, wiped his hands on his trousers, and told it, calmly and with years of military authority behind his voice, that it was a disgrace to its manufacturer and an insult to the concept of irrigation. The pump responded by emitting a single offended beep and shutting down harder. "That's not how encouragement works," a voice said from behind him. He turned, already smiling despite himself. "I don't encourage machines, I shame them. It's faster." She was balancing a crate of sensor nodes against her hip, one hand steadying it, her long ears flicking once in what he had learned meant skepticism. "On my world, we apologize to things before we fix them. On my world, we apologize after, usually at funerals." She snorted, which she always seemed mildly surprised by, as if humor still caught her off guard. She set the crate down and crouched beside him, peering into the open panel. "You rewired the intake wrong." "I rewired it creatively. That wire is meant to go into the blue socket. Color is a suggestion." She reached past him, her fingers quick and precise, unplugged the wire, and snapped it into place. The pump word paused dramatically, then roared to life with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting all day to prove a point. She straightened, brushing dust from her hands. Machines respond better to respect. He watched the water surge into the canal and shrugged. Or fear. They stood there a moment, listening to the system settle into its rhythm. Somewhere down the line, an automated gate opened late, clanged twice, and then behaved itself. He took that as a personal victory. "Another miracle of frontier engineering," he said. "If this keeps up, the crops might only die a little." She laughed again, ears lifting this time. "You humans have such optimism. Comes free with the trauma." They walked along the canal, checking readouts projected faintly in the air. The planet's network was old enough to have opinions about being used, and it expressed them by lagging whenever someone important was watching. She tapped one of the projections, frowned, and muttered something in her language that he suspected was not a compliment. "You curse technology very fluently," he said. "My people have had a long relationship with systems that don't work as promised." "Yeah," he said lightly, "we call that government." She tilted her head, considering this. "That explains a lot about your species." They reached the junction where the canal split toward the western fields. A local administrator's drone hovered nearby, its lens tracking them with professional disinterest. The drone cleared its synthesized throat. "Reminder," it said, "that unauthorized modifications to agricultural infrastructure must be logged within 24 standard hours." He looked at it. "You saw me fix it." "Correct." Then log that. I am not authorized to interpret intent. Then interpret success. The drone paused, as if thinking very hard about how much it disliked this conversation. Logging. Maintenance performed by contracted human labor unit and local auxiliary. Auxiliary, she repeated. See, he said cheerfully, you're official now. The drone drifted away, satisfied with its minimal exertion. She watched it go, ears lowering slightly. Auxiliary is better than what they usually call us, she said. Which is? She shrugged. Resources. He waited, but she didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. He had learned that on this planet, silence was often the most accurate response. They finished their checks as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the system humming along like it had always meant to. He packed up his tools, moving with the easy efficiency of someone who trusted his hands more than his thoughts. You'll be back tomorrow, she asked, unless the pump forms a union. She smiled. I will bring better food. Please don't threaten me. They walked back toward the settlement, a loose collection of prefabricated structures that had been assembled with more hope than planning. As they passed a group of workers arguing with a malfunctioning harvester, he raised a hand in greeting. Someone threw a spanner. It missed him by a generous margin. See, he said, respect. Later they sat on the steps outside the maintenance shed, eating ration packs that claimed to be stew. He suspected them of lying. She poked at hers suspiciously. This was grown here, she said. That explains the bitterness. She tasted it, then laughed despite herself. You survived wars, she said, and this is what defeats you. I know my limits. They ate in companionable quiet for a while. The night insects started their mechanical chorus, a sound engineered generations ago to be soothing and somehow managing it only intermittently. Why did you come here? She asked suddenly. He considered giving the short answer, the easy one, the one that fit on a form. Instead, he sighed. I was very good at breaking things. Then the galaxy decided it needed more fixing than breaking. I seemed like a lateral move. She nodded, accepting this as entirely reasonable. My people are good at surviving, she said, so they send us places where survival is needed. Sounds like a compliment. It is, she agreed, with footnotes. He glanced at her ears as they twitched, reacting to something unspoken. You ever think about leaving? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Leaving implies there is. They returned to the ditch at dawn, as if the land itself had arranged an appointment one could not miss. The sky over the plain had that washed, hospital blue quality common to worlds that wore thin atmospheres with pride. Small, stubborn stars still winked out above the sun's shoulder. Jonah carried the hand tools like a suit of armor, a compact splicer at his belt, a thermoclaw wrapped in a fabric sling that tried valiantly to pretend it was only part of his person and not the scaffold for 37 fragments of scar tissue. The village's irrigation was an old beast with new prosthetics, ceramic canals grafted with microvalves, bioengineered reeds that purged silt, and a skein of maintenance drones that sang like insects when they were happy and screamed like children when they were not. The machines were obedient enough. The people were less so. Lyra arrived in her usual way, unhurried but precise, carrying a kettled stack of plans folded into jerky pleats that would have made an origami master weep with either pride or envy. She had taken to wearing layers of cloth that made her long ears sit inside a soft nest. Sometimes she tucked a strip of tin in them as decoration, or as a joke, claiming it tuned her hearing to the right frequency for gossip. She looked human at first glance. The same general arrangement of bone and muscle, hands that could cup a seed, an easy, weary smile. But the ears, long and tapered, lined with a faint iridescence that caught the morning like a promise, made people look twice and then lower their eyes, as if being found staring was impolite even when the object of their gaze was not human. The ears were the herald of a whole history nobody wanted to talk about. "Morning," Jonah said. His voice was the kind of low thing that had survived a gunshot and 1,000 bad jokes. It carried a fiber of warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. Lyra answered with a small bow of the head and a joke about the canal's temperament. "Don't summon the valvetide," she said, as if the valve were a temperamental god and not a mass of polymer and firmware. "We have young shoots to please, not to humor." Jonah laughed. The sound was a little rusty and very human. Lyra's laughter came out like wind through reeds. It had a timbre that set Jonah's spine at ease in a way he had not expected. They spent the morning coaxing water along a stubborn channel. The village had learned to survive with a patchwork of measures. Desalination brine run through a lattice of filter glass, tidal pumps that siphoned moisture from subterranean aquifers. And sometimes, when the harvest was threatened, the import of water canisters from freighters that smelled faintly of the stars and were priced by people who did not live on the land. But the ingenuity of a small population bent on feeding itself was not to be underestimated. Where the system failed, fingers, human and otherwise, fixed it. Jonah's hands knew the exact temper of the metal to speak to. He worked with the calm of a man who had watched things fall apart in theaters far from here and found a way to keep them together. He had survived war the way a tree survives lightning, with a scarred trunk and new shoots. Lyra worked with a delicacy that seemed to come from the bones of her ancestors, as if someone had taught her how to persuade the world, not by brute, but by negotiation. She would hum the templates of old songs under her breath while coaxing the microvalves to loosen. The drones compensated for them both, spraying a fine mist when the pressure dropped and dancing a slow, earnest ballet along the canal's edge. During a lull, while they sipped bitter tea and the sun climbed like a careful overseer, Jonah said, "You ever think about going to the city? Not for trade. For a proper parade of people who clap when they see you rather than whisper." Lyra's smile was an entirely private thing. "City clapping is expensive. You must rent applause or bribe it with credentials. Besides, my people are not fashionable there." Jonah watched her eyes. There were quiet storms behind them, and when she turned away he could see the pale webbing of veins at her temples that pulsed when she thought hard. "What do they say this week?" he asked. "They say many things, mostly about what we can do. We are allowed because we make life continue and life is profitable. We are not allowed to upset the ledgers. That would be unseemly." Jonah made a face like he was going to spit at the sun, and then changed his mind. "Ledger people always have formal outfits," he said, "and bad table manners." She laughed, a small plot of sound. "We heard you talk yesterday. Your words have put several elders out of proper opinion." "You mean I told you a strange human idea?" Jonah's humor was thin and honest. He used it to lubricate edges. "Marriage is a choice, not a skill measure. Do not measure someone like a plow." They had gone through the motion of definitions before. What Jonah had said the night before, in simple, stubborn sentences that cut through a lifetime of assumption, had unsettled Lyra in a way romance could not explain. He had not professed love, had not spoken of futures painted in pastel. He simply had stated that worth was not a commodity. That was enough to surprise her. The human capacity to decide not to be useful and still be wanted seemed to her an act of rebellion. They joked to keep the world from noticing how deep their conversations cut. That morning, they traded barbs about the irrigation schedule and about the council's newest attempt to outsource dignity. A small, rotund councilman had proposed leasing Lyra's people as reproductive assets to a neighboring outpost in exchange for advanced filtration coils. The village elders had passed the idea around like a warmed pastry until someone choked on it. "It would solve the supply issue," said one, as if feeding people could ever be reduced to auction catalogs and supply lines. "And then," Jonah had said aloud in the meeting, the memory of steel and mud in his throat, What happens when the coils wear out? Will you auction the people again? Will you mortgage hearts like you mortgage crops? They'd all laughed then, uncomfortably, and someone had made a joke about the city and its formal outfits. Lyra had watched Jonah speak without drawing breath. She had suspected, for the first time, that someone could be angry without being violent, could object to the world with words and stamina, and be unafraid of the consequences. The afternoon brought a call. The northern reed field, the one with the experimental root net, had started to wither. The root net was a hybrid lattice of engineered mycelium and nanothreads designed to pull moisture from deep strata and share it with shallow-rooted crops. It behaved in ways that delighted grant committees and frustrated farmers, because it had opinions about humidity and would sometimes decide, unilaterally, that it would not be cooperative. They rode the rutted path in a utility cart with an old, cantankerous autopilot that insisted on humming a faded jazz standard for company. Jonah drove, which was to say he nudged controls and made confident noises while Lyra navigated with a tablet and a pen. They argued about whether the autopilot's taste in music was improved or ruined by the presence of goats. Mechanical goats recently donated by a philanthropic foundation that thought they were solving a culture gap, with chrome hooves and programmable bleats. The reed field was worse than they had expected. The root net had clotted in places, small, angry knots of biological detritus that choked the network. Seedlings lay like small, disappointed flags. The drones had stopped their singing and now moved with the determined economy of machines that had given up on optimism. "This thing is having a crisis," Lyra said. She knelt and put her hands into the damp soil. "If we can recalibrate the nutrient flow, we can coax it back." Jonah watched her, the angle of her ears catching the light. He thought of the way the village's council had discussed her people as if they were a patent waiting to be sold. He thought of his own hands, the ones that had learned to make decisions under fire, and how those hands had decided that they would not consent to people being treated as ledger entries. He straightened. "Let it be coaxed, then," he said. "Let us be gentle and unlovely about it." They worked until the stars that would be expected to shine came out, like punctual neighbors. Lyra's adjustments were a dance of patience and science. She rethreaded nanofilaments using a needle that hummed in the frequency of the root net. She introduced a living bacterium that the net liked, and the seedlings would not mind. Jonah assisted with brute tools and a stubborn refusal to give up. At one point, a drone fell into a mud puddle and started to squeak comically. Jonah rescued it with the solemnity of a fisherman pulling an old friend from the water. Lyra laughed, and the laugh carried across the field like unexpected rain. When the work was done, they sat on the edge of the field and ate salt-stewed tubers, and told each other stories of their respective pasts in fragments like people who had learned to be economical with trauma. Jonah spoke of sieges and the long, slow aftermath in which names were heavy and metals were lighter than expected. Lyra spoke of the ways her community had been shaped by necessity, the midwives who could read a heartbeat 10 meters away, the older women who kept genealogies like ledgers of survival, the way her people had traded in their own social claims in order to buy a foothold in a galaxy that claimed to be enlightened, while bartering human dignity under its breath. "You make jokes about the city's formal outfits," Jonah said, "but you also keep a list of ways your people survived. That's not the same as giving them away." Lyra looked at him with the air of someone, unsure whether to answer. "We survive by many means. Some are honorable, some are shameful. It is a braided thing." "Braids are good." Jonah frowned in thought as if braids were a useful metaphor he had not yet considered. "You know what my mother braided? Hair and recipes. She said that both needed attention or else they both fell apart." Lyra's face softened. Perhaps she was wise. There was an ease between them now, built on shared toil and the safety of small confessions. Humor was the mortar. They traded stories that were levity with edges. Jonah told Lyra about a time A supply drone had delivered a crate of aromatic soaps intended for the governor's spa to a farm collective, and how the goats had nearly declared a revolution based on scent alone. Lyra told Jonah about a formal banquet in the city, where a diplomat attempted to present her people's children as a diplomatic token, and was corrected by an offhand remark from a nervous server who had been trained in the ethics of bread distribution and had no patience for political theater. "You corrected a diplomat?" Jonah asked, impressed and amused. "No," she said. "The server did. My people do not usually attend banquets. We prefer bread." "Bread is revolutionary," Jonah said. "Most things in my experience are improved when bread is present." They fell silent then, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence allowed them to listen to the world the way it was. Out beyond the field, the village's lights hummed. Somewhere, a child sang out a fragment of an old lullaby, modulated by a cheap transmitter, the melody bouncing off distant hills like a promise. Jonah watched Lyra's ears as they moved minutely with the sound. He thought, without romantic urgency, that he wanted to be someone who was chosen, not because of what he could do for the village, but because he could be chosen. That thought fastened in him like a seed. "You know," Lyra said, breaking the quiet, "people will always find new ways to be cruel. We have been profitable for a long time. Profit is an efficient kind of blindness." "That's ugly to say." Jonah reached for the stew bowl and stole the largest tuber with theatrical greed. "But true. Still, I think people can be amended. We fix things all the time." "Some things cannot be fixed," Lyra said, and the honesty was heavy. "My mother said once, 'You can repair the canals, but you cannot unteach a market.'" Jonah chewed thoughtfully. "Maybe you can teach different markets, or maybe you can simply refuse to sell something that is not for sale." Lyra's eyes darkened, and for a moment she looked younger than she was, as if some memory had reached up and pulled at the edges of her face. Refusal is a dangerous posture in a galaxy that measures people by utility. He reached for her hand, an odd thing for a mechanic and a veteran to do in public, but the field was empty except for them, and the metal goats were asleep with their bells muted by habit. Lyra looked down at his hand on hers, then back into his eyes. There was no dramatized confession, no cinematic music. It was a practical act, a human taking another's hand like a tool, but a tool that mended. "You don't have to make a public show of defending me," she said quietly. "I am not a monument, I am a person." "No," Jonah's reply was a muscle of its own. "I don't want to make shows, I want to make choices." If that sounds like a small thing in a galaxy that misplaces small things for convenience, then let it be small. Small things are often what survive the long nights. Lyra's horns, the double curve of cartilage that marked some clans and in her case, were modest and polished, caught the light. She smiled at the ridiculousness of being recognized for qualities like fertility, as if the universe had a suggestion box and the galaxy had refused to listen. Humor was a blade she used to cut away shame. "You seem to believe small things will gather like gossip and become a movement." "I've seen worse leading to better," Jonah said. "I'll be boring about it. I'll be boring and stubborn." She squeezed his fingers back, and it was no longer about organs or function. It was about someone choosing someone else for reasons that could not be reduced to production metrics. It was about dignity without red tape. It was about quiet rebellion. As dusk bled into night and the stars took over the sky with the lazy authority of people who had been doing this for a while, something true and fragile settled into the space between them. They were not heroic in the operatic sense. There were no banners, no grand speeches. There was a veteran with hands that had known weight and a woman with long ears who had known the sound of being listed on ledgers. There was the small, stubborn possibility that two people could choose each other precisely because they did not owe each other anything. The village council would continue to debate the commodification of people. The city would continue to clothe its prejudices in silk and statistics. The irrigation canals would need mending again, as any good system does. But in the small weather of a single field, on a world that liked to call itself quiet, two people had performed a disagreeable and revolutionary act. They held to the idea that worth could be declared without an invoice. A week later, word traveled, never a direct thing, always an embroidery of rumor, that the northern field once saved had produced a harvest that nodded like a crowd. The council postponed its proposal, citing budgetary concerns and the inconvenient arrival of a visiting inspector who specialized in making debates more complicated. Gossip, always a poor historian, told versions of Jonah's speech that softened him into a local saint and hardened Lyra into a symbol of stubborn dignity. Children began to imitate the long ears with folded paper during schoolyard games, and for the first time, a practical joke about ear tuning became a kind of praise. Jonah's answer to the village's assumptions was neither fiery nor naive. He knew the galaxy's jaws could open wider than a village and swallow principles whole. He also knew the simple arithmetic of human contact. The more people who chose dignity in small ways, the less useful cruelty became. It was not an equation that would please any statistician, but it was an experiment he was willing to run on human time. Sometimes, in the middle of the night when the wind came down from the hills like a silver hand, Lyra would wake Jonah by tapping one of his scars and muttering a ridiculous complaint about a councilman's haircut. He would grumble like a retiring general and then laugh. The sound made the room brighter than any lamp. Their jokes were the village's suture, small, repeated gestures that held otherwise ragged edges together. On the eve of the harvest festival, a city delegation arrived with their suits and their polite, trimmed accents, and a crate of official pamphlets that smelled faintly of ozone and policy. They came to congratulate the village on engineering success, and with practiced curiosity, to ask about the people who had made it happen. The delegation's leader, a woman with eyebrows as thin as legal disclaimers, tilted her head when she saw Lyra and asked, before protocol allowed it, whether the village would consider a formal arrangement. Jonah, who had spent mornings thinking in the language of wood and metal and afternoons thinking in the language of small rebellions, answered in the way the village had come to expect from him, plainly with humor like a blade sheathed in common sense. "We can offer only what the fields give freely," he said. "We do not trade in people. We trade in crops, advice, and the occasional bad joke." The woman blinked, perhaps searching for proper policy under Jonah's sardonic armor. Lyra, standing beside him, did not shuffle or shrink. She lifted one long ear and said, in a voice that had learned to be firm where needed, "We are not a commodity. We are villagers. We will not be catalogued." For a heartbeat, the city woman looked like she might consult a manual. For a longer heartbeat, the village held its breath like a community listening to a new tune for the first time. Then someone in the crowd, a farmer with dry hands and a face like baked clay, laughed and clapped without ceremony, because laughter is the simplest form of approval, and because the joke landed where it was supposed to. On the side of decency, it was not a revolution. Revolutions are noisy and inefficient. This was a village negotiating itself toward a different practice, one of choosing. It was a small, stubborn thing, and in a galaxy that prizes headlines and harvests equally, small things are like good soil, they contain potential. Jonah and Lyra, who had begun as two people repairing what was broken, had become something like a rumor of kindness. Contagious, slightly scandalous, and entirely practical. The sun here was not fond of ceremony. It rose like a patient landlord unlocking shutters, deliberate, without grand speeches, letting warmth seep into the fields in a way that made tired machines hum and earthworms consider their day's work. Jonah liked mornings for the way they made mistakes look repairable. He had spent the better part of a decade learning to see problems as a series of manageable edges, cut away the rust, replace a valve, coax a stubborn pump into cooperating with the right sequence of tugs and soot. The war had taught him something similar, Except in the war the edges were people, and the right tugs were held with bone-deep reluctance. Here, among canals and seedlings, his hands remembered a steadier rhythm. Pull, tighten, test, laugh when something improbable worked. He found happiness in small, spatial triumphs. A siphon that no one believed would last the week but did. A drone net that had taken to catching wind and refusing its coating, reprogrammed with 3 jokes about its mother's routing protocol and then, mysteriously, perfectly aligned rows of water. The colonists said the land here had more temperament than yield. Jonah said it had personality and stubbornness, attributes he could negotiate with. He carried his past like a pocket compass that sometimes pointed to things he'd rather not face. Mostly, however, it pointed to work that needed doing. Lysara appeared on a slope of young barley like a rumor you could not ignore. A woman's silhouette against the skyline, long ears tucked back in the way her people kept them when the wind tried to read them like letters. She looked human enough at a glance, hands deft and calloused, skin the kind of sun-burnished bronze you got from too many hours outside. But those ears, arched and elegant, gave her motion an unfamiliar punctuation. They were functional as much as aesthetic, flattened when she concentrated, twitching when a distant motor died, and she was calculating whether the repair kit on the truck had the right gasket. The township had a name they used when selling the place to newcomers, Verdant Reach, but locals called it other things aloud and softer in the dark. The end of roots, the patch, the place that doesn't answer back. It was a postage stamp of civilization, arranged around a handful of retrofitted warehouses and the communal cistern, a rounded stone thing with the dignity of a stubborn animal. The cistern was where Jonah and Lysara crossed paths most days. He'd been sent by the Oversight Cooperative to inspect the saline filters. She was there for the same reason, though the municipal ledger suggested 2 different job tickets. Somewhere in the bureaucracy they both existed as rectangles, technician, laborer, with numerical IDs that chewed their names into usable data. Names here got you smirks and occasional favors. Names were not currency. She smiled at him the first time with a small, sideways lift that made her ears tremble like ribboned antennae. He joked about the cistern's moodiness. The thing had been sulking for 3 days and would probably pour its heart out if you offered it coffee. And she laughed, a sound that started in her throat and finished in her hands. Humor became a bridge. Practical matters followed. Old seals, a section of piping that favored condensation over cooperation, a drone swarm with the taste for plants but not their owners. They worked with the easy intimacy of people solving a problem together, those silent agreements that blossom when trust is built from elbow grease and shared tools. The colony's gossip mapped people like constellations, and Lysara's position in that firmament was a bright smudge surrounded by parentheses. She was useful. Her people, the Vashari, had been assimilated into the galactic economy centuries ago for practical reasons. They bore children with a consistency that confounded interspecies fertility charts, and they possessed immunological properties prime for cross-species gestation. Medical corporations had stamped them as breeders in sanitized legalese, a term that fluttered at the edges of anything humane. Colony contracts often allowed for Vashari to work as midwives or incubators, their private bodies summarized in clauses and arbitration schedules. They were the ones you hired when children were desired but no alliances were feasible, the ones who provided a resource the universe valued and then, often, forgot. Jonah had read about such arrangements in the years after the ceasefires, and before he arrived at the Reach. He had seen paperwork that smoothed over lives with signatures. He had seen the ghosts of people in refugee lines who still smiled when offered hot water, and he thought then that the polite removal of dignity was the only thing more dangerous than the raw violence he'd known on the front. To his surprise, he didn't meet pity in Lysara's eyes. He met routine. She spoke about schedules and yields with the same care she applied to coaxing a pump back to life. There was no armor of bitterness, only muscle memory from a life organized around duty. At first, their conversations were about water pressure and whether the PLC nodes preferred the old binary pulses or the colony's new AI-directed flow. They argued about the best way to persuade an ancient hydroseeder to cooperate. Jonah favored blunt corrective force and a greater supply of WD-3, an industrial lubricant with the acronym and the optimism of early colonists. Lysara argued for delicate recalibration and a little coaxing code. One evening, under a sky that remembered 1,000 quiet wars in stars, she admitted she wrote micro-poems to the irrigation conduits at night when the pumps were sleeping. "What do they say?" Jonah asked. He had the barest knowledge of what poets here were supposed to be like. In his youth, propaganda had taught him a very different aesthetic. "They forgive me," she said. "They complain about the taste of last season's fertilizer, but they forgive me." Her ears flattened in a way that looked like embarrassment. Jonah laughed because the image of a poem being embroidered into rusty metal made him think of the absurdity that tied fragile things together. The township had its own microeconomy of jokes. There was the farmer who claimed his sheep had unionized and the peddler who sold vintage pre-war spices and claimed they were from his grandmother's home planet. He could never name it properly and changed details each time. It was, the town decided, likely a marketing tactic. In the margins of their work, Jonah and Lysara traded wry comments that lightened the daily grind. She showed him how to placate a stubborn moisture sensor with a sequence of light taps. He taught her the medicinal properties of sarcasm. The jokes were tiny rebellions against a world that wanted utility and nothing more. Not everything could be smoothed with laughter. There were lines you didn't cross in verdant reach, an invisible chalk that the overseers enforced half-heartedly. The Vashari had rights, in the sense that contracts recognized their functions, but everything else, property, marriage, political office, remained a game played by a different set of terms. Once, Jonah saw an official from the regional cooperative make the mistake of high-fiving a Vashari worker, and then immediately correct their hand position when reminded of the appropriate distance. The official's face was a lesson in procedural embarrassment, but Jonah's stomach clenched. He had been a soldier long enough to know how policy could become violence less gracefully than a gun. Still, among the fields, people mixed under the complicity of daily need. Children chased drones, their laughter lifting like wire in sunlight. The market sold recombinant fruit that tasted like summers Jonah had never had but wanted to own for a moment. The air smelled like metal and soil, and the subtle scent of small, persistent miracles. They were a people who had learned how to grow community on a planet that refused to be pinned down by maps. Lysara's background was a map of gentle omissions. She told him about her village, if that was what you called a Vashari cluster, like someone describing a favorite knot of seaweed, familiar but often misunderstood. There were no large claims of lost nobility or grand exile, simply the steady cadence of family obligation. Her people had been rehomed to be useful, she said once, and she did not say it like a complaint so much as a fact, the way you would say that rain comes in winter. There were industries that purchased certain services, she admitted, and some families were careful to compartmentalize that part of life the way other families had cupboards with mismatched lids. The conversation drifted, light and full of human noise, until the sun bled into the horizon and the cistern reflected a pale red like a stopped heartbeat. The first time she mentioned the phrase Jonah would replay in his head for months. She said it in a half-joke as they watched a juvenile irrigation drone perform a loop the wrong way. "No one marries my kind," she said, as if the sentence belonged to the drone's navigational errors rather than to people. Her ears twitched, not with the sort of shame she'd been taught to expect, but with a quiet, almost academic wonder. How do you sum up a whole species in the slight discomfort of others' eyes? He didn't answer at first. He had been doing this long enough to measure his words. The past taught him that certain truths could be detonative if spoken without care. Then maybe they are missing out on something, Jonah answered instead, thinking of the ordinary injustices he had watched, the transactions that taught certain people to live as if their worth was their function. He did not yet know what else he would say. They worked until their knees were sore. Machines made sounds like sleeping beasts. Night in the Reach came wrapped in a fine metallic aroma, an aftertaste of industry settling into rest. The stars were visible in a way the city had stolen from him, clear, cold, and sharp, like small witnesses. He walked home that night with his palms smelling of oil and barley, a permanent sort of identity he did not particularly object to. There was a softness to his nights now, threaded through the small repairs and the jokes and the slow, mutual tending of communal things. It was not the kind of domesticity he had once imagined. War had burned out his appetite for romantic illusions. But the restoration of broken systems had its own satisfactions, the replacement of a part, the reconfiguration of a valve that would keep 100 small lives watered. He slept like a man who had learned to celebrate the quiet victories, and when he dreamed they were mundane. A pump that hummed in perfect pitch, a field that did not eat away the seed at dawn. The next morning Lysara brought him a breakfast wrapped in waxed cloth, a patchwork of flavors she said were from her grandmother's kitchen. The cloth smelled faintly of lavender and circuitry cleaning solvent. Jonah laughed and thanked her. He was careful not to call it kindness, because kindness felt too much like currency in a place that traded favors for survival. They ate as ships went overhead, a thin triangular shadow that made noise like an arthritic insect. The ship was distant and aloof, the governmental presence that the township accepted as a given, like gravity or inadvisable loans. As days passed, their conversations feathered outward. Jonah taught Lysara to laugh at the ruins of propaganda, at the universe's tendency to inflate the importance of schedules. She taught him to listen to the soil in a way that felt like magic, how it sighed when a micronutrient was missing, how it settled when you stopped trying to force growth, and instead coaxed it along with small, embarrassing lullabies. They traded stories about things neither of them had seen. Lysara spoke of ancient festivals where Vashari ears were decorated to signify consent and mourning at once. Jonah spoke of nights under other stars when he'd watched a cohort of soldiers play a childish card game to keep their memories of home alive. The town began to notice the two of them moving in tandem. Eyes that had been wary because of custom now watched with a curiosity that folded neatly into everyday chatter. There were the usual slurs muttered by some, the bristling of bureaucratic resentment from others, and the small, eager whispers of people who liked a narrative that included defiance. It was not revolution. It was the slower erosion of old cement. When a drought threatened the eastern fields and negotiations with the regional water board went poorly, people began to listen to solutions more than to pedigrees. Jonah and Lysara were not reckless activists. They were technicians. Their politics lived in the efficient rerouting of water, in the clandestine salvage of an abandoned desalination unit, in the small victories that kept crops alive. Yet the practical nature of their work became its own quiet politics. Each time a field that should have failed did not, there was less room for people to use lineage as an excuse for cruelty. One evening, after tightening a failing seal and performing the ritual of wiping hands on trousers, they sat by the cistern and watched the moon scrape its light across the water like a silver plow. Jonah remembered the war's simpler equations, where people were identified as friend or enemy, and there was no gray between. Here, in the soft reflection of the cistern, the world was complicated in ways that made him want to stay. Lysara reached out and touched his hand with the kind of categorical gentleness opponents sometimes used in truce and lovers used in passing. Her ears flicked toward him. He took the contact as a thing that could be accepted without dramatic pronouncements. They were, in the small way of people who survive and then begin to live, becoming part of each other's toolbox for survival. Humor spared them from heavy sentimentality. A joke about a bureaucrat's inability to pronounce Lysara's name properly had both of them laughing until they had to breathe. Laughter was their salve. It made indignation manageable. It let them go forward. The Reach went about its business with a new, tender momentum. Things were not fixed. They were instead negotiated in the quiet between tasks. Jonah could feel the slow recalibration inside himself, the old soldier learning to measure worth not only in function, but in the quality of another's quiet company. He wasn't naive. There were big machines in orbit that moved people and policy, and there were laws that would take a long time to be humanized. But the small, personal resistances, laughter shared in the dark, a hand taken without calculation, had their own gravity. When Lysara said, with a casualness belying its weight, "No one marries my kind," Jonah did not reply with pity. He replied with a candor that came from watching too many things fall apart and too many others be rebuilt. "Then maybe they're just making a practical error," he said, and told her a story about a pump that had refused to run until someone told it was forgiven. She stared at him, ears opening to hold the sentence like a cup. For the first time, he saw a flash of something like bewildered dignity ripple across her face. It was not the shot of romance that lit a different future so much as recognition. Recognition that someone had named the difference between being useful and being chosen, and had chosen to refuse both calculation and convenience. They worked the fields, mended the pipes, told jokes to the machines, and measured the universe in small acts of repair. In the daily business of irrigation and bartered laughter, something gestated, an idea that would be more dangerous than a policy memo and more potent than a mandate.